Imagine a single nation controlling nearly 1/4 of all the land on Earth, commanding every major ocean, collecting taxes from hundreds of millions of people, and printing a currency so powerful that merchants from Shanghai to Buenos Aires accepted it without question, then losing all of it within just a few decades. If you want to understand how empires are truly built and destroyed by money, stay right here, because this story will completely change how you see the world of finance and power. Make sure you subscribe right now, because we cover exactly this kind of financial history every single week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. The British Empire did not become the wealthiest power in human history by accident. And it certainly did not collapse by accident either. Because every rise and fall was driven by deliberate financial choices made by bankers, merchants, and politicians over several centuries. It was constructed on a carefully engineered system of trade control, military dominance, colonial extraction, and financial innovation that took generations to build and only began to crack when the debts of 2 world wars became impossible to ignore or repay. The story begins in the late 16th century, when England was still a minor maritime player compared to the mighty Spanish and Portuguese empires, which had already carved up the most profitable territories across the Americas and Asia, leaving England scrambling for whatever opportunities remained on the edges of an already divided world. That underdog status pushed England's merchants and crown to be more aggressive, more creative, and more ruthless in their commercial strategy than any of their European rivals. And that hunger would eventually make them the dominant financial force on the planet. In 1607, the founding of Jamestown in Virginia marked England's first lasting colonial foothold in North America, and in the decades that followed, British settlement expanded steadily, driven not by romance or adventure, but by a ruthless and practical desire to control land, labor, raw materials, and trade routes that could generate sustainable and scalable wealth for investors and the crown back in London. Every new colony was essentially a financial project wrapped in a flag, designed from the very beginning to extract maximum economic value and deliver those profits back to British shareholders and the royal treasury. The Caribbean colonies became Britain's first truly profitable financial engine, particularly after the Sugar Revolution transformed the island economies of Barbados, Jamaica, and other territories beginning in the 1640s. When massive sugarcane plantations began producing enormous quantities of sugar that European consumers craved so intensely that planters became extraordinarily rich almost overnight. Sugar was the oil of the 17th century, a commodity so lucrative and so addictive to European markets that it reshaped entire economies, redirected shipping lanes, and funded the construction of financial institutions that would later power the Industrial Revolution itself. This sugar wealth, however, was built almost entirely on the forced labor of enslaved Africans. And the transatlantic slave trade became so deeply embedded in British commercial life that ships operating from Bristol, Liverpool, and London carried hundreds of thousands of human beings across the Atlantic, generating profits that flowed directly back into British banks, merchant houses, and investment portfolios. Those profits from human bondage were then reinvested into manufacturing, infrastructure, and finance, meaning that the foundations of British industrial capitalism were built, at least in part, on one of the greatest crimes in human history. The Navigation Acts of the late 17th century gave Britain's colonial wealth a powerful legal framework that economists call mercantilism, requiring all colonial trade to be carried in British ships with British crews, and forcing colonies to export their raw materials exclusively to Britain, where they were processed, taxed, and resold at prices that consistently favored British merchants over the colonial producers who actually grew or mined the goods. This system turned colonies into captive suppliers and captive customers simultaneously, creating a one-way financial pipeline that drained colonial wealth steadily and relentlessly into the coffers of the British economy year after year after year. The East India Company, chartered in 1600, became perhaps the most powerful and extraordinary financial institution the world had ever seen. Functioning simultaneously as a trading corporation, a private military force, and a governing authority across vast territories in India and Southeast Asia. Collecting taxes, waging wars, and redirecting the wealth of entire subcontinent economies into the hands of British shareholders. At its peak, the East India Company commanded its own army of over 200,000 soldiers, making it a more powerful military force than most sovereign nations of the era, all operating in service of shareholder returns. A truly decisive turning point came in 1765, when the Mughal emperor granted the East India Company the Diwani rights over Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, giving the company direct legal authority to collect land, revenue from millions of Indian farmers, and effectively transforming a trading corporation into a sovereign, territorial government with the power to tax an entire civilization. This single financial and political event shifted the flow of wealth from the Indian subcontinent to Britain so dramatically that historian Utsa Patnaik calculated, using trade and tax data, that Britain extracted approximately $45 trillion from India between 1765 and 1938 alone. Cotton grown in India or the American South was shipped to England's textile mills, where cheap factory labor converted it into finished cloth that was then exported back to colonial markets at prices carefully set to undercut and destroy local textile producers, meaning Britain extracted raw materials on one end and flooded those same territories with manufactured goods on the other end. This commercial loop was one of the most brilliantly designed wealth extraction systems in economic history, generating enormous profits at every single stage of the production and distribution cycle, while systematically preventing colonial economies from developing their own industrial capacity. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in Britain in the mid-18th century, was the financial multiplier that transformed colonial wealth into absolute global dominance, as innovations like the steam engine, the spinning jenny, and the power loom allowed British factories to produce manufactured goods faster, cheaper, and in greater volumes than any competitor nation could realistically hope to match. Britain's combination of cheap colonial raw materials, captive export markets, abundant cheap labor, and revolutionary manufacturing technology created a self-reinforcing economic machine that generated wealth at a scale and speed the world had genuinely never witnessed before in all of recorded history. After defeating Napoleon at Waterloo in 1815, Britain entered a period historians call the Pax Britannica, lasting from 1815 to 1914, during which the Royal Navy controlled every major shipping lane on the planet, and British commercial interests dominated virtually every corner of the global trading system without any serious military or economic rival capable of challenging them. During this extraordinary century of dominance, Britain became the undisputed workshop of the world, producing roughly one-third of all global industrial output at its peak and using its naval supremacy to ensure that British merchants always traded on favorable terms in every market from China to Chile. The City of London emerged during this era as the undisputed financial capital of the entire global economy, functioning as the global center for banking, marine insurance, currency exchange, commodity trading, and international investment, with the British pound sterling serving the role that the African dollar occupies today as the world's primary reserve currency that every nation needed to hold in order to conduct international trade. Lloyd's of London insured ships from every maritime nation. British banks financed railroads from Argentina to Australia. And Barings or Rothschilds could move enough capital to determine whether sovereign governments lived or collapsed under the weight of their debts. By 1913, an astonishing 43% of all internationally invested capital in the world originated from Britain, with approximately £4 billion invested overseas in railroad bonds, utility companies, and government debt across the United States, Argentina, India, Canada, and Australia, making Britain by far the world's largest international creditor and the essential source of capital for global infrastructure development. This was Britain at its absolute financial zenith, a country of 45 million people that somehow managed to bankroll the economic development of the entire world while simultaneously maintaining the most powerful navy ever assembled in human history. However, that very financial sophistication was quietly creating dangerous structural weaknesses that would eventually prove fatal to British dominance. Because British banks and wealthy investors increasingly preferred to lend their capital overseas at higher returns rather than reinvest those profits into modernizing aging domestic British industries that desperately needed technological renewal. John Maynard Keynes himself criticized this pattern in the 1931 Macmillan Report, warning that British financial institutions were systematically starving domestic industry of the capital investment it needed to remain globally competitive, essentially choosing short-term overseas returns over the long-term industrial health of the nation. By the early 20th century, both Germany and the United States had industrialized with remarkable speed, aggressively challenging Britain's commercial supremacy in steel production, chemical manufacturing, electrical technology, and machine tools, narrowing the competitive gap at a pace that deeply alarmed British economists and industrialists who could see the foundations of British manufacturing dominance being steadily eroded. Germany's steel output surpassed Britain's in the 1890s, and American manufacturing had already become far larger in total scale, signaling that the industrial era Britain had created was now producing rivals powerful enough to eventually dethrone the very nation that invented modern industrial capitalism. The First World War, erupting in 1914 after decades of military and economic tensions with Germany, placed catastrophic financial strain on the British government, forcing it to borrow enormous sums from American banks, raise taxes to levels previously unimaginable, and begin selling off the vast overseas investment portfolio that had been accumulated over more than a century of patient capital accumulation. By the war's end in 1918, Britain had spent approximately £11 billion on the conflict, transformed from the world's largest creditor nation into a significant net debtor, and permanently damaged the financial mechanisms that had sustained imperial power throughout the Victorian era. The Great Depression of the 1930s delivered another devastating blow, forcing Britain to abandon the gold standard in September 1931. A decision that effectively ended the pound sterling's credibility as the world's primary reserve currency and shattered international confidence in British financial institutions that had for generations been regarded as the most stable and trustworthy monetary anchors in the entire global financial system. When Britain left gold, other nations lost faith in the imperial financial order that London had maintained for over a century, accelerating a shift in global financial power toward New York that would be fully completed by the devastating cost of the Second World War. When Britain entered the Second World War in 1939, it was already financially weakened, and the six-year conflict consumed virtually all of Britain's remaining foreign exchange reserves, forced the country to accept enormous financial obligations to the United States under Lend-Lease arrangements, and accumulated sterling debts to colonial territories that would take decades to resolve. By 1945, Britain's war spending had totaled approximately £37 billion, and the country was so broke that even after victory was declared, food rationing continued until 1954. While the new Labour government had to borrow a massive $3.75 billion loan from the United States just to keep the economy functioning. India's independence in 1947 marked the moment. Britain permanently lost what had been called the jewel in the crown, the colonial territory that had contributed immeasurably to British prosperity through tax revenues, raw material exports, and military manpower across two world wars, and whose loss signaled to the entire world that the British Empire was genuinely and irreversibly in retreat. The partition of India into two nations, accompanied by horrific communal violence, also damaged Britain's moral standing globally. making the continuation of colonial rule across the rest of the empire increasingly difficult to justify politically, economically, or in the court of international opinion at the newly formed United Nations. The Suez Crisis of 1956 delivered the most publicly humiliating demonstration of Britain's financial and geopolitical decline, when American President Dwight Eisenhower threatened to sell US dollar reserves of the British pound and trigger a currency collapse unless Britain immediately withdrew its military forces from Egypt, where Britain and France had launched an invasion to recapture the nationalized Suez Canal without American approval or support. Britain's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Harold Macmillan, informed Prime Minister Anthony Eden that Britain's gold and dollar reserves were hemorrhaging so rapidly under American financial pressure that the country faced an economic catastrophe within weeks, forcing a humiliating televised withdrawal that permanently destroyed any remaining illusion of British superpower status. During the 1960s, Harold Macmillan's famous Wind of Change speech and the accelerating costs of colonial administration led Britain to grant independence to dozens of African territories in rapid succession, as the British Treasury calculated that the military and administrative expenses of maintaining colonial control had become far greater than any realistic economic benefit those territories could ever generate for the British economy. The economics of empire had simply inverted. Territories that had once been net contributors to British wealth had become net drains on a British décharge, on a British deceive, net steries, on a British state spending, defense commitments, and the enormous cost of servicing war debts accumulated between 1914 and 1945. In January 1968, just weeks after devaluing the British pound by 14.3% in a painful capitulation to currency market pressures, Prime Minister Harold Wilson announced the withdrawal of all British military forces from their bases east of Suez, ending a strategic military presence across the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and the Indian Ocean that had defined and sustained British global power for more than 100 years. This single announcement effectively acknowledged what financial analysts and historians had been documenting for years: that Britain could no longer afford the military infrastructure necessary to defend an empire, and that the age of British global dominance had conclusively ended not with a dramatic military defeat, but with a quietly devastating budget decision, when Hong Kong was returned to Chinese administration on July 1, 1997. It marked the symbolic final chapter of an empire that had once governed a quarter of the world's land surface and ruled over more than 400 million people across every continent on the planet. What financial history ultimately reveals about the British Empire is profoundly instructive for every era: that wealth and power built on extraction, debt, and the suppression of others contains the seeds of its own inevitable destruction, and that no financial system, however brilliantly engineered, can permanently overcome the forces of competition, nationalism, and the compound interest of accumulated injustice. So what do you think? Was the collapse of the British Empire ultimately inevitable, given the financial pressures it faced after 2 world wars? Or could smarter economic decisions at key moments have preserved British dominance for far longer than it lasted? Do you believe the empire was undermined more by external forces like American competition, or by its own internal financial mistakes and the moral contradictions at the heart of colonial extraction? Drop your honest opinion in the comments below, because conversations like this are exactly what this channel exists for, and every single perspective helps us understand this history more completely. And if this story gave you a genuinely new way of thinking about how empires rise and fall through the lens of money and finance, please subscribe right now so you never miss another story that connects the financial dots of world history.